Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Imagine finding out you're not invited to Christmas with your family. Not because of a misunderstanding, but because they think you're a loser. That's what my brother told me, and it all spiraled from there. It all started innocently enough. About 3 weeks before Christmas, I shot my mom a quick text asking what time we were supposed to show up for dinner. I was already half distracted, scrolling through work emails on my laptop, when my phone buzzed with a reply. But it wasn't from my mom, it was from my brother, Mark. "You're not invited this year," the message read. For a moment, I thought he was joking. Mark had a terrible sense of humor, the kind that relied on sarcasm and insults disguised as banter. So, I texted back, "What are you talking about?" His reply came quickly, and it felt like a punch to the gut. "It's a family-only thing this year, and honestly, Christmas isn't a place for losers." Losers. That word echoed in my mind as I stared at the screen. My first instinct was to call him and demand an explanation, but something stopped me. Instead, I typed out a single question. "What do you mean?" The next message was worse than the first. "Look, everyone agrees. You're 32, single, still working that dead-end job, and basically haven't done anything worth celebrating this year. It's better this way." I didn't know what to say. For a few seconds, I just sat there, staring at the words as if they might disappear. When they didn't, I locked my phone and set it down, trying to process what I just read. Mark wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for my whole family. My parents, my other siblings, maybe even my cousins and aunts. The people I'd grown up with, shared holidays and inside jokes with, had apparently decided that I wasn't good enough to join them this year. It wasn't like I didn't know how they felt about me. Mark had been the family's golden boy for as long as I could remember. He had the perfect wife, 2 adorable kids, a big house, and a high-paying job in tech. Meanwhile, I was still renting a tiny apartment, working a job that barely paid the bills, and dodging awkward questions about my love life at every family gathering. But to outright exclude me from Christmas? That felt like a line they'd never crossed before. I spent the rest of the day replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out how things had gotten to this point. Was it because I didn't go to college like Mark? Or because I didn't settle down and start a family like our sister, Lisa? For years, I'd brushed off their comments and jokes, telling myself they didn't really mean it. But now it was clear that they did. I thought about texting my mom to ask if Mark was serious, but the idea of her confirming it made my stomach turn. Instead, I just let it sit. Maybe they'd realize how cruel this was and reach out to apologize. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The next day, I got a text from my mom. It was short and painfully neutral. "Just wanted to let you know we're keeping Christmas small this year. Hope you're okay with that." I wasn't okay with it, but I didn't respond. What was the point? If they all agreed with Mark, then nothing I said would change their minds. Over the next week, I kept waiting for anyone, to reach out and tell me it was all a mistake. Maybe Mark had exaggerated. Maybe my mom didn't realize how much it hurt to be excluded. But the days passed, and no one said a word. It felt like I was being slowly erased, like I'd never really been part of the family at all. One night, I called my best friend, Anna, and told her everything. She listened quietly as I vented, then said, "That's messed up. I don't care what's going on in your life. Family is supposed to be there for you." I knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. "I just don't get it," I said. "How can they treat me like this and still sleep at night?" Anna hesitated before answering. "Honestly, people like your brother think they're better than everyone else. It's not about you. It's about his ego." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't about me at all. But that didn't make it hurt any less. By the time Christmas week rolled around, I'd made up my mind. If they didn't want me there, fine. I wasn't going to beg for their approval anymore. Instead, I started making my own plans. I bought a bottle of wine, stocked up on snacks, and picked out a few movies to watch on Christmas Eve. It wasn't the holiday I'd wanted, but at least it was mine. As for my family, I decided they could keep their judgment and their family-only dinner. I was done trying to fit into a place where I clearly wasn't welcome. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The thing about my family is that their toxicity isn't always loud. It's more like this constant undercurrent, a steady drip of subtle insults and passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. Over the years, I learned to shrug it off, laugh along, and tell myself it was just their way of showing love. But this time, Mark's message had crossed a line. Mark has always been the star of the show. Growing up, he was the kid who aced every test, won every trophy, and charmed every teacher. By the time he hit 30, he had checked every box on the perfect life checklist: a high-paying tech job, a gorgeous wife, 2 photogenic kids, and a big suburban house with a manicured lawn. My parents adored him, and my mom practically worshipped the ground he walked on. And me? I was the black sheep. I didn't go to college, and I didn't care much for climbing corporate ladders. My job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I actually enjoyed it, something no one in my family could understand. To them, I was just wasting potential. The holiday dinners were the worst. Mark would talk about his work trips to Europe or how his 5-year-old was already reading chapter books, and my mom would beam at him like he'd just cured cancer. Then, inevitably, the conversation would shift to me. "So, what's new with you?" someone would ask. I'd talk about something I was excited about, a new project at work, a book I was reading, or a recipe I'd tried, only to be met with polite smiles and quick pivots back to Mark. They didn't even bother to hide their lack of interest anymore. This year, though, things were different. I didn't even have the chance to be the butt of their jokes because they decided to cut me out completely. And you know what? I was done. After reading Mark's second message, I stared at my phone for a long time. Part of me wanted to fire back, to call him out for being such an arrogant jerk. But another part of me, the tired part, just didn't have the energy. Instead, I blocked his number. Then, I sent a group text to my mom and dad. "Hey, I'm swamped with work and other stuff, so I won't be able to make it to Christmas this year. Hope you all have a great time." My mom's reply came within minutes. A single thumbs up emoji. That was it. My dad didn't bother responding at all. I half expected my mom to follow up later, maybe ask what was going on or if I was okay. But no, the silence was deafening. The strangest thing happened over the next few days. I started to feel lighter. I'd been dreading Christmas for weeks, knowing it would be another round of Mark's bragging and my parents' thinly veiled disappointment. Now, for the first time, I didn't have to deal with any of it. I spent my evenings binge-watching my favorite shows, eating takeout, and ignoring the world. I wasn't sad. I was relieved. It was like stepping off a treadmill I hadn't realized I was on. For so long, I'd bent over backward trying to fit into their version of success. I went to family gatherings even when I felt like an outsider. I smiled and nodded through their backhanded compliments. I laughed at Mark's jokes, even when they were at my expense. But this year, I finally said no, and it felt good. Of course, a small part of me wondered if they'd notice I was missing. Would they talk about me at dinner, wondering why I didn't show up? Or would they carry on like nothing was different? The answer came sooner than I expected. 3 days before Christmas, I got a message from my cousin, Sarah. "Hey, are you coming to the family thing this year? Haven't seen you in ages." I debated how to respond. Sarah was one of the few family members I actually liked. She wasn't close with Mark and didn't get caught up in all the competitive nonsense. But I didn't want to drag her into the drama, so I just said, "Nope, sitting this one out. Hope you guys have fun." Her reply surprised me. "Wait, why not? Everyone's gonna be there." Something about her tone made me pause. Did she not know? I decided to be honest. Mark told me I wasn't invited. Said Christmas isn't a place for losers. The typing bubble appeared immediately, and then her response came through. "What? Are you serious?" We ended up talking for almost an hour. Sarah was furious. She had no idea what Mark had said, and she told me she thought the whole family-only thing was weird to begin with. Apparently, no one else had been excluded. It was just me. "I'm so sorry," she said. "That's awful. Honestly, I think Mark gets off on making people feel small. Don't let him ruin your holiday." Her words stuck with me. Mark did get off on making people feel small, didn't he? It was like some twisted power trip for him. And the worst part? My parents let him get away with it. By Christmas Eve, I had fully embraced my decision to skip the family gathering. I bought a bottle of wine, ordered my favorite Chinese food, and queued up a few movies I'd been meaning to watch. For the first time in years, I wasn't dreading Christmas. There was no anxiety, no knot in my stomach, no rehearsing what I'd say if someone made a snide comment. Instead, I felt peaceful. I didn't know what the future held or how this would affect my relationship with my family in the long run. But in that moment, I didn't care. I wasn't going to let them dictate my worth anymore. They could keep their perfect holiday with Mark and his shiny life. I was carving out space for myself, on my terms, and you know what? It felt like the best gift I'd ever given myself. Christmas Eve arrived with none of the usual stress I'd come to associate with the holiday. No need to iron a shirt I didn't want to wear, no running late because I'd underestimated holiday traffic, and no sitting at a table bracing for the inevitable moment Mark would turn the conversation into a highlight reel of his accomplishments. Instead, I set up my perfect evening. I bought a bottle of my favorite red wine, a little pricier than I'd normally spring for, but it felt justified. I ordered enough Chinese food to last me through Christmas Day, because leftovers are a gift unto themselves, and queued up a mix of movies I'd been wanting to watch. My plan was simple. Eat, drink, and laugh. all without anyone else's judgment or commentary. It was liberating. For once, I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to preempt someone's criticism. I didn't feel like a disappointment or the odd one out. I felt calm. I settled into my couch, the glow of the Christmas tree lights filling the room, and actually smiled to myself. The peace didn't last long. Around 8 o'clock, just as I was halfway through a second glass of wine and debating whether to start Die Hard or stick with something more traditionally festive, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, expecting a delivery promo or spam, but it was a text from Sarah. "Hey, why aren't you at Christmas? Everyone's been asking where you are." For a moment, I just stared at the message. I'd expected my absence to go unnoticed, maybe even welcomed. The idea of anyone asking about me, let alone Sarah reaching out, caught me completely off guard. I debated whether to respond. Sarah had always been one of the more decent members of the family. She wasn't part of the competitive nonsense, and she was the only person who'd ever seemed genuinely interested in my life. But still, I wasn't sure how much I wanted to share. Finally, I decided honesty was the best route. Mar told me I wasn't invited. Said Christmas is no place for losers. Her reply came almost instantly. "What? Are you serious? That's messed up." I had no idea. We ended up texting for the next hour. At first, Sarah was just angry. Angry at Mark for saying something so cruel. Angry at my parents for letting him get away with it. And angry at herself for not noticing sooner. "I knew Mark could be a jerk sometimes," she wrote. "But I thought it was just harmless teasing. I didn't realize it was like this." I didn't hold back. I told her about the years of backhanded compliments, the constant comparisons to Mark, and the feeling of never being good enough. For the first time, I let it all out. Sarah didn't try to downplay it or make excuses, which I appreciated more than I could put into words. Instead, she validated everything I'd been feeling. "You don't deserve that," she said. "Honestly, you deserve better than this whole family dynamic. It's toxic." She paused before adding, "Let me know if you want to hang out tomorrow instead. I don't feel great about being part of this whole thing now that I know." Her offer took me by surprise. Sarah had always been close to the family, and I didn't expect her to stand up to Mark or my parents. But here she was, offering to spend Christmas with me, instead of sitting through another polished performance of the Mark show. I didn't give her an answer right away. Instead, I thanked her for reaching out and told her I'd think about it. After our conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. I'd spent so many years convincing myself that my family's treatment of me was normal, that it was just their way of showing love, even if it didn't feel like love to me. But Sarah's reaction was different. She was genuinely upset, not just for me, but at them. She didn't excuse their behavior or tell me to get over it. She saw it for what it was: cruel. I replayed Mark's message in my head, the way he'd so casually dismissed me as a loser and said I wasn't worth celebrating. It still hurt, but now, instead of feeling ashamed, I felt angry. Angry at Mark for saying it, angry at my parents for enabling it, and angry at myself for putting up with it for so long. That anger was new. It was sharp and uncomfortable, but it also felt like the beginning of something. Maybe I didn't have to keep playing the role they'd assigned me. Maybe I could write my own story. As Christmas Eve turned into Christmas Day, I thought about Sarah's offer. The idea of spending the holiday with someone who actually cared about me was tempting, but it also felt unfamiliar. For so long, I'd associated Christmas with judgment and disappointment. What would it be like to have a holiday that was just good? I texted Sarah early that morning. "If the offer still stands, I'd love to hang out today." Her reply came seconds later. "Of course it does. I'll bring cookies." For the first time in years, I was actually looking forward to Christmas. It wasn't going to be perfect, but maybe that was the point. It didn't have to be. It just had to be real. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like I might finally get that. Christmas morning was quiet, almost eerily so. I hadn't set an alarm, figuring I'd wake up whenever I felt like it. For the first time in years, there was no frantic rush to get dressed, no balancing gifts in my arms as I juggled keys and coffee on the way out the door. It was just me, my cozy apartment, and the faint sound of carolers on the radio I'd forgotten to turn off the night before. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee and was scrolling through my phone when I heard the knock. It was light but deliberate, and for a moment I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. Who would come by on Christmas morning? When I opened the door, there was Sarah, her curly hair a little wild from the winter wind and a bright red scarf wrapped around her neck. She was holding a tray of cookies covered in plastic wrap, a bottle of wine tucked under her arm. "Merry Christmas," she said with a wide grin. "I figured you shouldn't have to spend a day alone." For a second, I was too stunned to respond. Sarah had always been kind, but this was above and beyond anything I'd expected. She must have noticed my hesitation because she added, I mean, if you're okay with company. I can totally leave if you've got plans. No, no. Come in, I said quickly, stepping aside to let her in. I just wasn't expecting anyone. Well, surprise, she said, setting the tray of cookies on my coffee table. I figured the least I could do was bring some holiday cheer. Plus, I made way too many cookies, and my mom keeps telling me to stop baking like I'm feeding an army. We both laughed, and just like that, the awkwardness melted away. Sarah kicked off her boots and plopped down on my couch like she'd been there 100 times before. So, she said, grabbing one of my throw pillows and hugging it to her chest. What's the plan for today? Watching movies? Eating your body weight in Chinese food? Pretty much, I admitted, sitting across from her. I wasn't exactly prepared for company. Good thing I came prepared then, she said, holding up the wine. I figured we could start with cookies and coffee, then move on to wine and whatever food you've got. Sound good? It sounded perfect. As the morning turned into afternoon, Sarah and I talked about everything and nothing. She told me about her job, which she liked most days, but admitted could be overwhelming. They act like I'm supposed to have all the answers all the time, she said. But half the time, I'm just winging it and hoping no one notices. I laughed, nodding in agreement. That's basically my entire approach to life. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was having a real conversation with someone who wasn't judging me or trying to fix me. Sarah wasn't interested in comparing notes or measuring who had achieved more. She just listened. At one point, the conversation drifted to the family. I guess I shouldn't be surprised about Mark, Sarah said, nibbling on a cookie. He's always had this way of making people feel small. I mean, I know he's smart and successful, but does he have to rub it in everyone's face? Yeah, I said, swirling my wine glass. It's like he thrives on it. And the worst part is, no one ever calls him out. Mom and Dad just let him do whatever he wants. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. I've always felt like I had to play along with it. Like if I didn't, I'd be the next target. I guess I never realized how much worse it was for you. Her words caught me off guard. I'd spent so many years feeling invisible or dismissed by my family that hearing someone acknowledge my experience felt strange. But in a good way. You're the first person who's ever said that, I admitted. Well, it's true, she said. And honestly, I'm kind of done with it. The whole family dynamic is so exhausting. I feel like we're all just performing for each other. I knew exactly what she meant. Every holiday, every gathering felt like a competition. Who had the best job? The nicest house? The most accomplished kids? It was a cycle I'd never been able to break, and I'd stopped trying a long time ago. Later in the afternoon, Sarah asked a question that stuck with me long after she left. Do you think they'll ever change? She asked, pouring herself another glass of wine. I let out a short laugh. Honestly, probably not. Mark's not going to suddenly grow a conscience, and Mom and Dad will keep enabling him because it's easier than admitting he's not perfect. Sarah nodded, but didn't say anything. The silence hung between us, heavy, but not uncomfortable. But you know what? I added after a moment. For the first time, I don't care. If they want to keep playing their little games, they can. I'm done trying to win. Sarah smiled, raising her glass. To being done with their nonsense, she said. To being done, I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. When Sarah left that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She'd reminded me that I wasn't alone, that someone in my family actually saw me and cared about me for who I was, not for what I'd accomplished or how I measured up to Mark. As I cleaned up the empty wine glasses and cookie crumbs, I realized that this Christmas, though simple and unplanned, had been one of the best I'd ever had. Because for the first time, it wasn't about trying to fit in or prove myself. It was just about being me, and that I realized was enough. The morning after Christmas was quiet and uneventful at first. I woke up later than usual, still riding the surprising wave of contentment from the day before. Spending Christmas with Sarah had been unexpectedly healing. For the first time, the holiday didn't feel like a burden or an obligation. It had been simple and genuine, free of competition and veiled insults. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down to scroll through my phone. That's when I saw them. 3 missed calls from my mom and a text from Mark. The text read, "Why did Sarah bail on Christmas to hang out with you? She said you're mad at us or something." The audacity of his message floored me. No Merry Christmas. No acknowledgement of the cruel words he'd flung at me a few weeks ago. Just a demand for answers, as if my absence had somehow inconvenienced him. I didn't reply. What was there to say? Explaining myself to Mark felt like shouting into a void. He'd made it clear how little he thought of me, and I wasn't about to waste my energy trying to change his mind. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few hours later, my dad called. At first, I considered ignoring it. He rarely called me unless it was a birthday or holiday, and given the circumstances, I wasn't in the mood for a polite catch-up. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what he'd say. When I answered, his tone was sharp, almost accusatory. "What's going on with you?" he asked. "Why weren't you at Christmas yesterday?" I took a deep breath, already feeling the tension creep into my shoulders. "I didn't come because I wasn't invited," I said evenly. "Mark told me Christmas wasn't a place for losers, so I made other plans." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought he might actually be shocked. But when he spoke again, his voice was tinged with annoyance. "Mark said that?" "Yes," I replied. "And it's not just about what he said. It's about how I've been treated for years. Every time I come to these things, I feel like I'm walking into an interrogation. Like I'm not good enough to sit at the same table as the rest of you. I'm tired of it." Another pause. Then he sighed and said, "Well, I'm sorry you feel that way." Hearing those words stung more than I expected. It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was a dismissal, a way to shift the blame back onto me, as if my feelings were the problem instead of their behavior. "I don't think you understand," I said, my voice growing steadier. "This isn't just about one comment or one holiday. It's about years of feeling like I don't belong in my own family. And if that's not going to change, then maybe it's better if I stop showing up altogether." My dad didn't respond right away, and when he finally did, his tone was more cautious. "Look, I don't want you to feel like you're not part of the family. But you have to understand, Mark's just Mark. He doesn't mean anything by it." I let out a bitter laugh. "That's the problem, Dad. Everyone excuses his behavior, because that's just Mark. But what about me? What about how it makes me feel?" There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, I wondered if he'd hung up. Then he said, "I'll talk to him." It wasn't much, but it was something. The conversation left me emotionally drained. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, replaying every word in my head. My dad's reluctance to take any real accountability wasn't surprising, but it still hurt. It reminded me of all the times growing up when my feelings were brushed aside, my voice drowned out by the louder, more important ones in the room. Later that afternoon, Sarah texted me. "Did you hear from anyone yet?" "Yeah," I replied. Mark sent a passive-aggressive text, and Dad called. Not much progress, though. Her response was immediate. "Figures. They'll probably never get it. But that doesn't mean you have to put up with it." She was right. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn their approval, hoping they'd see me as an equal. But maybe it was time to stop waiting for something that might never come. That evening, I got another message from Mark. This one was longer, but no less infuriating. "Dad said you're upset about something I said? Look, I was just being honest. If you can't handle the truth, that's on you. But maybe instead of getting mad at me, you should think about why everyone else is moving forward and you're stuck in the same place." Just saying. I didn't reply. What was the point? Mark had no interest in understanding my perspective, and engaging with him would only make things worse. Instead, I blocked his number again. The next few days were a roller coaster of emotions. Part of me felt lighter, like I'd finally taken a step toward breaking free from the toxic dynamic that had weighed me down for so long. But another part of me felt angry and hurt. I wanted my family to see me, to really see me, and acknowledge the pain they'd caused. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized something. I didn't need their validation to move forward. For the first time, I started to think about what my life could look like without constantly trying to fit into a mold that wasn't made for me. I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. I was done being the family scapegoat. Whether they changed or not, I wasn't going back to the way things were. And that realization felt like the first step towards something better. A few days after Christmas, life had settled into an unusual but comforting rhythm. I still hadn't spoken to Mark, and my parents were keeping their distance after my conversation with my dad. It was almost as if they didn't know how to approach me anymore, which, to be honest, suited me just fine. It was late in the evening when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. She'd been a constant source of support since Christmas Day, and seeing her name light up my screen instantly put a smile on my face. But the message she sent stopped me in my tracks. "So, I might have caused a scene with Mark. It began." I blinked, rereading the sentence a couple of times before typing back. "What happened?" Her reply came quickly, and with each message, I felt a mix of shock, amusement, and pride. Apparently, Christmas dinner at my parents' house had gone exactly as I'd imagined. Mark holding court, recounting his latest professional triumphs, while everyone else nodded along. It started when he made some comment about my job. Sarah wrote. He said something like, "Well, I guess not everyone can have a career that actually matters," and laughed like it was some kind of joke. I don't know what came over me, but I just snapped. Sarah explained that she'd been biting her tongue for years, putting up with Mark's superiority complex like the rest of the family. But after spending Christmas with me and hearing my side of things, something in her had shifted. I told him he had no right to talk to people like that, she wrote. I said he's not as perfect as he thinks he is, and maybe he should try being a decent human being instead of constantly putting everyone else down. The mental image of Sarah standing up to Mark in the middle of Christmas dinner was both surreal and deeply satisfying. I could practically hear the stunned silence that must have followed her outburst, the clinking of utensils as everyone froze mid-bite. What did he say? I asked, almost holding my breath. He was furious, Sarah replied. He tried to laugh it off at first, like he always does, but I didn't let him. I kept going. I told him that his honesty isn't honesty at all. It's cruelty disguised as confidence. And I said that just because he's successful doesn't mean he's better than the rest of us. I stared at the screen, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me was overjoyed that someone had finally called him out, but another part of me felt guilty. Are you okay? I typed. Her response was immediate. Honestly, I feel great. It felt so good to finally say what I've been thinking for years. Everyone was shocked, of course. Mom tried to smooth things over, and Dad just sat there like a statue. But I think Mark got the message. He didn't say much for the rest of the night. As I read her messages, something clicked. For so long, I'd assumed I was the only one who felt the weight of Mark's arrogance. He had a way of zeroing in on people's insecurities and using them as leverage, but I thought I was his favorite target. Hearing Sarah's story made me realize that wasn't true. Mark didn't single me out because I was uniquely flawed or inadequate. He treated everyone that way. It was just easier to focus on me because I wasn't playing the same game he was. He's been like this forever, Sarah continued. I remember when we were kids, he'd always make these snide little comments. Back then, it was about who had the best grades or who was the fastest runner. Now it's about jobs and money and houses, but it's the same thing. He has to make everyone else feel small so he can feel big. Her words hit me like a thunderclap. I'd spent so much of my life internalizing Mark's judgment, letting it chip away at my self-worth. But the problem wasn't me, it was him. As our conversation went on, I found myself reflecting on all the ways Mark's behavior had shaped the family dynamic. His need to dominate every interaction, his relentless criticism disguised as humor, and my parents' willingness to let it slide. It all fit together like pieces of a puzzle. I think they're scared of him, I typed. Mom and Dad, they don't want to stand up to him because it's easier to just let him have his way. Sarah agreed. It's like they've convinced themselves that keeping the peace means keeping him happy, no matter what it costs the rest of us. But honestly, I think he needs to be knocked down a peg. Her confidence was inspiring, but I couldn't help wondering if standing up to Mark would really make a difference. He wasn't the type to admit he was wrong, and I doubted one confrontation would change him overnight. Still, hearing Sarah's story gave me hope. Maybe I wasn't as alone in this as I thought. That night, I couldn't stop replaying Sarah's words in my head. She'd stood up to Mark in a way I never had, and it made me wonder, could I do the same? For so long, I'd avoided conflict, choosing silence over confrontation. But maybe silence wasn't the answer anymore. Maybe the only way to change the dynamic was to challenge it, to refuse to play along with the rules Mark had written. It was a scary thought, but also an empowering one. For the first time in years, I felt like the cracks in my family's facade were starting to show. Mark's grip on the narrative wasn't as unshakable as it seemed, and maybe, just maybe, I could carve out a space for myself that wasn't defined by his judgment. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The days following my conversation with Sarah were like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of my family's judgment on my shoulders. It was as if stepping away from their expectations had unclenched a knot I hadn't realized was there, one that had been tightening little by little over the years. It wasn't just about the absence of their criticism. It was the space I now had to think clearly, to consider what I actually wanted for myself without their voices drowning out my own. I didn't have to prepare for the next subtle dig or rehearse polite responses to questions designed to make me feel small. Instead, I could simply exist, and that was something I hadn't truly experienced in a long time. Sarah became my lifeline during this period of change. We started texting daily and meeting up for coffee or lunch whenever our schedules aligned. It wasn't just the familiarity of having family around, it was the realization that someone within the family actually saw me for who I was. One afternoon, we were sitting in a little cafe downtown, sipping lattes and swapping stories. Sarah was talking about a hiking trip she'd taken the previous summer when she suddenly said, "You should come with me next time. It's not as intense as it sounds." mostly just walking and enjoying the view. I laughed. I'm not exactly the outdoorsy type. Neither am I, she said, grinning. But it's not about being an expert. It's just about trying something new. Her words stuck with me long after the conversation ended. How many things had I avoided trying because I was too afraid of failing or being judged? It wasn't just my family's criticism that held me back. It was the way I'd internalized it, letting their voices become my own. That realization sparked something in me. Over the next few weeks, I started looking at my life with fresh eyes. I thought about the dreams and interests I'd put on hold, the risks I hadn't taken because I was too busy measuring myself against the impossible standards my family had set. The first step was small but symbolic. I signed up for a pottery class. I'd always loved the idea of working with clay, shaping something with my hands, but I'd never allowed myself to pursue it. It felt frivolous, impractical, exactly the kind of thing Mark would scoff at. But as I filled out the registration form, I realized I didn't care what he or anyone else thought. This was for me, and that was reason enough. The class turned out to be more challenging than I'd expected, but in the best way possible. The first time I sat at the wheel, my hands shaking as I tried to center the clay, I felt a mix of frustration and exhilaration. By the end of the session, I had nothing to show for my efforts except a lopsided lump that barely resembled a bowl. But I couldn't stop smiling. At the same time, I started making changes in other areas of my life. For years, I'd stayed in a job that was safe but unfulfilling, convincing myself that stability was more important than happiness. But now, with a newfound sense of clarity, I began updating my resume and exploring opportunities that excited me. One afternoon, Sarah introduced me to a friend of hers who worked in event planning. "I think you two would really hit it off," she said, and she was right. The conversation flowed easily, and by the end of the day, her friend had offered to help me get my foot in the door at her company. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start, and more importantly, it reminded me that I wasn't as stuck as I'd always believed. As my perspective shifted, so did my interactions with others. I found myself opening up more, taking risks in small but meaningful ways. Sarah invited me to a dinner party with her friends, and though the thought of walking into a room full of strangers made me nervous, I went anyway. To my surprise, I actually enjoyed myself. Sarah's friends were warm and welcoming, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was part of a group where I didn't have to prove anything. I didn't have to pretend to be more successful or interesting than I was. I could just be myself, and that was enough. These changes weren't without their challenges. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I was doing the right thing or if I'd ever truly escaped the shadow of my family's judgment. But every time those thoughts surfaced, I reminded myself of the progress I'd made. I thought back to Christmas, to the quiet joy of spending the day with Sarah instead of enduring another round of Mark's ego-fueled commentary. I thought about the satisfaction of shaping clay into something tangible, even if it wasn't perfect. And I thought about the growing sense of independence that came from pursuing my own path, no matter how uncertain it felt. One evening, after a particularly good day at work, I sat down with a notebook and started making a list. It wasn't a list of resolutions or goals, but a collection of things I wanted to try, things that had always interested me, but never seemed worth it in the eyes of my family. As the list grew, so did my excitement. Hiking, photography, learning to play the guitar, maybe even taking a solo trip somewhere I'd never been. Each item felt like a tiny act of rebellion, a way of reclaiming the parts of myself I'd buried for so long. By the time I finished, I realized something important. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future. Not because I had all the answers or because everything was suddenly perfect, but because I was finally giving myself permission to live on my own terms. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. It had been a month since Christmas, and while the raw sting of being excluded had faded, the scars of my family's behavior lingered. I'd made peace with my decision to step away from their toxic dynamic, but the tension still hung in the air like an unresolved chord. That's why, when my mom's name flashed across my phone screen one afternoon, I hesitated before answering. "Hey, Mom," I said cautiously. She didn't waste any time getting to the point. "I think we need to talk," she said, her tone calm but tinged with urgency. "There's been enough drama, and I just want to clear the air." I wasn't entirely sure what clearing the air meant in her book, but I agreed to meet her for coffee the next day. Part of me wanted to believe this could be a turning point, that maybe she was ready to acknowledge the harm that had been done. But another part of me, the part that had been through this dance before, braced for disappointment. When I arrived at the cafe, Mom was already seated, a steaming cup of tea in front of her. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks for coming," she said as I sat down. I nodded, not entirely trusting myself to speak just yet. She started with what I now recognize as her usual approach to conflict, softening the edges, trying to smooth things over without actually addressing the root of the problem. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," she said. "And I just want you to know that Mark didn't mean to hurt you. You know how he is. He can be blunt, but it's only because he wants the best for you." I felt my jaw tighten, the familiar wave of frustration rising in my chest. "He called me a loser, Mom," I said, my voice measured but firm. "That wasn't blunt. That was cruel." She hesitated, clearly thrown off by my refusal to let her brush it aside. "I know it sounded harsh," she said, "but he didn't mean it like that. He just wants you to do better, to be happy." I cut her off, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "No, Mom. He doesn't want the best for me. He wants to feel better about himself. And you let him. Every time he puts someone down, you act like it's not a big deal, like it's just part of who he is. But it is a big deal. It's hurtful. And I'm done pretending it's not." Her face turned red, whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. "That's not fair," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I've always tried to support you." "No, you haven't," I said, cutting her off again. "You've supported Mark. You've supported his ego and his need to be the center of attention, even when it meant tearing the rest of us down. And I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not coming to family events just to be treated like I don't matter." For a moment, she just stared at me, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Then she leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. "I don't want to lose you," she said quietly. "But you're making this harder than it needs to be. Can't you just let it go and move on?" I felt a pang of sadness at her words, but it was quickly replaced by resolve. "I have moved on," I said. "That's the whole point. I've spent my entire life trying to live up to expectations that were never realistic, trying to earn respect that should have been given freely. I'm not doing that anymore." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. "This isn't up for debate, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "Either treat me with respect, or don't expect me to show up. It's that simple." The rest of the conversation was strained and awkward. Mom tried to argue, tried to justify her actions and Mark's behavior, but I could see that she was grasping at straws. For the first time, I wasn't letting her off the hook, and it clearly made her uncomfortable. When we parted ways, she hugged me tightly, as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers. "I'll think about what you said," she murmured. "Good," I replied. "I hope you do." Walking back to my car, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a strange sense of empowerment. Standing up to my mom had been harder than I'd anticipated, but it also felt necessary, like tearing off a bandage to let a wound finally heal. I didn't know if my words would actually make a difference. Maybe she'd go home and convince herself I was being dramatic, that it was easier to keep things the way they were. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd start to see things from my perspective. But in the end, it didn't matter. I wasn't fighting for their approval anymore. I was fighting for myself, for the life I wanted to build, free from their judgment and expectations. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally in control. It didn't take long for word to get back to Mark about my conversation with Mom. I'm not sure if she told him outright or if he overheard her venting to someone else, but within days, my phone buzzed with a long, passive-aggressive text from him. "So, I hear you're blaming me for all your problems now? Nice. I'm sorry you can't handle a little honesty, but that doesn't mean you need to turn the family against each other. Maybe instead of complaining about how everyone treats you, you should look at your own choices. You're the one tearing the family apart, not me." I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. The sheer audacity of his message was almost comical. It was classic Mark: deflect, minimize, and twist the narrative so that he came out looking like the victim. For a brief moment, I considered responding, but then I thought better of it. Engaging with Mark would only lead to another round of verbal sparring, and I was done giving him the satisfaction. Instead, I deleted the message and blocked his number, for the second time in as many months. A few days later, I got an unexpected call from my dad. I hadn't spoken to him since the awkward coffee date with Mom, so when his name appeared on my screen, I was hesitant to pick up. Part of me braced for another round of blame or dismissal, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey, Dad," I said cautiously. "Hi," he replied, his voice uncharacteristically tentative. "I was wondering if we could talk in person." I wasn't sure what to make of his request, but I agreed to meet him at a diner near my apartment the following evening. When I arrived, Dad was already seated at a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his shoulders slightly hunched. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "Of course," I replied, though my tone was guarded. For a while, we made small talk discussing the weather and how work was going. But eventually, Dad cleared his throat and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "Look," he began, "I know things have been tense lately, and I want you to know that I've been thinking a lot about what you said." I stayed quiet, letting him find his words. "You're right," he admitted after a moment. "We've let Mark get away with too much over the years. He's always been difficult, but we didn't want to rock the boat. I guess we thought it was easier to let him have his way than to stand up to him." His honesty caught me off guard. For so long, I'd felt like my parents were blind to Mark's behavior, unwilling or unable to see the damage he caused. Hearing my dad acknowledge it, even in small terms, felt like a step forward. "I don't want to lose you over this," he continued, his voice soft but steady. "You're just as much a part of this family as anyone else, and I hate the thought of you feeling like you're not welcome." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was something, and for the first time, it felt genuine. "Thanks, Dad," I said, my tone equally soft. "That means a lot to hear." The weeks that followed were a slow but noticeable shift. My parents began reaching out more often, not just with the obligatory "how are you" texts, but with real conversations. Mom invited me to lunch one afternoon, and while the visit wasn't entirely free of tension, it felt more like an effort to connect than to gloss over our issues. Even Mark's attitude began to change, though not in the way I'd hoped. He never apologized outright. Mark would rather chew glass than admit he was wrong. But his usual digs and snide comments became less frequent. When I ran into him at a family gathering, he was almost civil. It wasn't lost on me that these changes were likely the result of my parents stepping in and setting some boundaries, however subtle they might have been. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when old habits crept back in, but for the first time, it felt like progress was possible. In the midst of all this, I continued focusing on myself. I went to my pottery class every week, finding a quiet joy in the process of shaping and reshaping clay. I started hanging out with Sarah and her friends more often, building a support system that felt authentic and free of judgment. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, surrounded by half-finished pottery projects and the hum of soft music, I realized something important. I was no longer waiting for my family's approval to feel whole. For years, I believed that my worth was tied to how they saw me, that I needed their validation to be happy. But now, I understood that happiness wasn't something they could give me. It was something I had to create for myself. The fallout from that Christmas had been messy and painful, but it had also been a turning point. It forced me to confront the dynamics that had shaped my life for so long and to set boundaries I should have set years ago. Things weren't perfect, and I didn't expect them to be. But for the first time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, moving forward on my own terms. And that, I realized, was more than enough. The following Christmas was unlike any I'd ever experienced. It wasn't grand, there weren't elaborate decorations, and there certainly wasn't a perfectly curated holiday photo with everyone in matching sweaters. But for the first time, it felt like Christmas truly belonged to me. I decided to host a small dinner in my apartment. It started as a casual idea during one of my hangouts with Sarah. "What if we just did our own thing this year?" she'd suggested. "Something simple and fun. No drama, no expectations. Just people who actually enjoy each other's company." The idea stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I started planning. I invited Sarah, a couple of her friends who I'd grown close to over the year, and one of my co-workers who'd mentioned they didn't have family nearby. The guest list was small, the menu was modest, and I decided not to stress about perfection. For once, the holiday wasn't about appearances or meeting someone else's expectations. It was about creating an atmosphere of warmth, connection, and joy, things I hadn't realized I'd been missing for so long. On Christmas Eve, I spent the day tidying up my apartment and prepping the food. The scent of roasted vegetables and spice cider filled the air, mingling with the soft glow of string lights draped around my living room. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt cozy and inviting, a reflection of everything I wanted this new tradition to be. Sarah arrived first, carrying a platter of her famous sugar cookies and a bottle of wine. "I hope you're ready for these," she said with a grin, setting the cookies on the counter. "I may have gone overboard with the sprinkles." "I wouldn't expect anything less," I replied, laughing as I examined the cookies, each one a colorful masterpiece. As the other guests trickled in, the apartment buzzed with laughter and conversation. We shared stories, played a few board games, and even broke out into an impromptu karaoke session after someone found my dusty old microphone. It was chaotic and unscripted, but it was perfect. Midway through the evening, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I was surprised to find my parents standing there, a small gift bag in my mom's hand. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice tentative but warm. "We just wanted to drop this off and wish you a Merry Christmas." I invited them in for a moment, and while the interaction was brief, it felt significant. They didn't stay long, just long enough to exchange pleasantries and hand me the gift, which turned out to be a lovely set of pottery tools. "We heard you were getting into ceramics," my dad said with a small smile. "Thought you might like these." I thanked them, genuinely touched by the gesture. It wasn't an apology or a grand gesture of reconciliation, but it felt like a step forward. When they left, I didn't feel the usual heaviness that accompanied our interactions. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of peace. They were trying in their own way, and for now, that was enough. Mark, unsurprisingly, didn't make an appearance. I hadn't heard from him since his last passive-aggressive text months ago, and honestly, I didn't miss him. For so long, I'd measured the success of a holiday, or any family gathering, by whether or not I could avoid his criticism. This year, with him out of the picture, I realized just how much better things could be. The absence of his judgment created space for something new, genuine connection, laughter, and a sense of belonging that didn't come with strings attached. As the night wound down, I found myself sitting on the couch, a plate of leftover cookies in my lap, watching as Sarah and the others packed up their things. My apartment was a mess, empty wine glasses on every surface, crumbs scattered across the floor, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd truly celebrated Christmas. Not the version of Christmas my family had imposed on me, with its unspoken rules and impossible standards, but a version that was mine. Later that night, as I cleaned up and reflected on the evening, I realized something important. Family isn't about blood. It's about the people who see you, who accept you for who you are, and who show up when it matters most. For years, I tried to force myself into a family dynamic that didn't make room for me, believing that if I just tried harder, I could find my place. But now, I understood that my place wasn't something I had to fight for. It was something I could create for myself. This Christmas wasn't perfect, but it was real. And as I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a joyful night, I knew I'd found something more valuable than approval or validation. I'd found freedom, peace, and the beginning of a new tradition. One that finally felt like home,